going to present some work in progress, and I shortened the title to fit the session here on short presentations. And so I'm going to talk about the frequency of payments in government assistance programs and their effect on the purchase of temptation goods. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with temptation goods, I think the term was originally coined by Sendil. You can think of alcohol or tobacco, basically goods that provide some sort of benefit at the time that they're consumed, but not really any benefit beyond that. So several studies have found that consumption responds to the timing of income receipt. And so in particular, when there's an infusion of cash like a payday, people are more likely to purchase discretionary goods and oftentimes temptation goods like alcohol and tobacco. And so here I have one example from the food stamps program, which is showing that this spike implies that there's increased spending on food in the day or two after people receive their food stamps. And this could be important for health because it's been shown that people sometimes run out of money towards the end of the month, and so this can have an impact on, for example, hospitalizations of diabetics or food insecurity. So this is basically the behavioral economics literature showing that these payday effects do exist. There's another literature mostly from development economics that looks at what the effect is of cash transfers on alcohol and tobacco spending. And a recent systematic review found that there's really not much relationship between receiving these cash transfers and spending money on alcohol and tobacco. And this holds for conditional cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers, as well as for different types of designs, including RCTs. And so one of the challenges, and sort of the big picture challenge, is how to reconcile this finding from behavioral economics that there really are these payday effects with the findings from development economics that there's really not much going on here. And so I don't necessarily have a unified framework that I'm going to be presenting, but this is sort of the big picture that I'm hoping to address. So in particular, what I'm going to be looking at is whether the frequency of payments affects temptation spending. And the reason why that might matter is because this presents a particular policy lever that policymakers could manipulate in order to either encourage or discourage spending on things like alcohol and tobacco. And so that's sort of what separates this analysis from what's been done before, is that I'm really going to be looking at a particular program design element. And so secondarily, I want to figure out basically who's affected by these policies, and in particular, is it going to be existing users or new users? In other words, is this on the intensive or extensive margin that this matters? And so the setting for this is in Peru, and it's a conditional cash transfer program called Juntos. And the program is designed for low-income rural households, and it's very similar to other conditional cash transfer programs where you basically have to send your kids to school or provide them with well-child visits, etc. And they're fixed lump sum payments that are mostly given to the female head of the household. And until or through 2009, they were monthly payments of $33. And then starting in 2010, they basically doubled the payment but halved the frequency with which the payments were made. So basically, like, the total annual payment was held constant, and there was really just this natural experiment that varied the frequency with which the payments were made. And so it went from going from monthly to every other month. And this is the natural experiment that I'm trying to exploit here. And so why might the frequency of payments affect the likelihood of purchasing temptation goods? So first of all, there could be something related to bulk purchasing. And I'm not going to show you results from that, but so far I really haven't found much there. The big one is present bias. So the idea that people who have some sort of, they're flush with cash, they might be more likely to splurge on temptation goods like alcohol and tobacco because of self-control problems or some sort of short-term impatience. Another possibility is that there could be projection bias here, so that what I'm getting at is that towards the end of the month, individuals might be in a state of craving or hunger where they might be more likely to mispredict their future preferences and might be more likely to overestimate how much money they should be spending on temptation goods. And so I'll focus, well, I'm not really going to be identifying any of these biases, but this is sort of the motivation behind this evaluation. So I'm going to be looking at national household level survey data, which was collected annually, 2007, 2012. And what I'm going to be looking at is a difference in differences estimator. So this is before and after this policy change went into effect for members of this conditional cash transfer program compared to basically a matched control group from districts that were not eligible. And so I'm going to be looking at the change in budget shares for several different categories of temptation goods that I'll talk about in a minute. And this beta coefficient is the one that I'm going to be looking at, which is like the interaction between a treatment indicator and a pre-post policy change indicator. And as I said, I'm looking at a control group of similar households, low-income households from low-income districts that didn't participate in this program. And there's two samples that I'm working with. There's a cross-sectional sample and a smaller panel sample. In my panel analyses, I'm using household fixed effects, which means that I'm looking at basically the same households before and after this policy change occurred. So jumping right to the main results, since I don't have much time. So I looked at 6 different categories of temptation goods: alcohol and tobacco, as well as sweets, which is pastries, candies, chocolates. I looked at soft drinks, commercially prepared foods that were consumed in the home. So in Peru, this could be something like tamales. In the US, it's like TV dinners. And then finally, food that was consumed outside of the home, mostly in restaurants. And so what I'm showing here is the relative effect size for the budget shares that were consumed for each of these 6 categories, as well as conditional budget shares. So conditional budget shares would be the budget shares conditional on purchasing any of the categories. So for example, the budget share spent on alcohol conditional on having bought at least 1 drink during the period. And so what you can see is for alcohol, there was actually a somewhat consistent increase of 55 to 80% increase after the policy went into effect. For tobacco, there's sort of mixed evidence. It goes into the direction that you'd hypothesize, but it's not really consistent across these regressions. For sweets, there's somewhat consistent relationship where there's an increase of about 10 to 40% of the budget share that was spent on sweets after this policy happened. And for the last 3 categories, we didn't really find much. Just summing up, because I'm running out of time, basically what I've found so far, and this is again work in progress, is that larger, less frequent payments, they increased the amount that was spent on alcohol and sweets, but not really on these other categories consistently. And I didn't show you this, but the effect sizes were somewhat small in absolute terms, but in the relative terms that I just showed you, at least for alcohol and sweets, the effect size is somewhat large. And again, I didn't have time to show you, but basically the entire effect was concentrated on this intensive margin, which actually does correspond to the conditional budget shares that I showed you in the last slide. And so the implications would be that if we were to pay out in installments instead of in a lump sum, that could lead to less consumption of temptation goods. One thing I haven't talked about is the cost effectiveness of this, so whether really the benefits of this policy change would outweigh the costs, and that's something that I'm going to be working on. There's a couple limitations I'd raise. One is just the underreporting potential for temptation spending, as well as that this was household level data, so I'm not really looking at who in the household was affected. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your comments. Thanks.